Do you think this is potentially the decline of what one might call the American empire? I was looking at how long empires tend to last, and before you came, and there's this 250-year figure, which is famously popularized by a British historian called Sir John Glubb in his essay "The Fate of Empires and the Search for Survival." After analyzing empires from I can't say that word, Assyrians, exactly what I said. Assyrians to the British, Glubb found that despite differences in technology, geography, religion, and surprisingly shared a similar lifespan and life cycle, Glubb argued that empires typically go through a predictable sequence of stages over those 250 years. The first one being the Age of Pioneers, outburst and conquest. The Age of Conquest, which is the military dominance. The Age of Commerce, which is vast wealth creation. The Age of Affluence, comfort and a shift from duty to selfishness. The Age of Intellect, focus on philosophy and education over defense. The Age of Descendants, internal division, massive inequality and collapse. So if you view the United States as an expansionist project from its very inception, pushing westward across the North American continent through its power, then the math says, if you take it from 1776 to now, to 2026, it's exactly 250 years old. So if you use Glubb's 250-year life cycle model from 1776 to now, political scientists argue that we are in the Age of Descendants of the American empire. This stage is typically characterized by deep internal political division, vast wealth inequality, massive national debt, and a cultural shift away from a shared sense of civic duty.
So first of all, that's a pretty accurate description of what's happening in the United States. However, you have just touched on something that I feel very strongly about, which is that I don't believe in historical inevitability.
Interesting.
And I think is very dangerous. Mm-hmm. So the idea that we are on a slippery slope downhill and we can't stop it because that's the way history is going, or alternatively, the idea that everything is fine and it will continue to be fine because liberal democracy has triumphed, which is what we thought in the 1990s. Anytime you think that something is inevitable, that takes away your willingness to act. Mm-hmm. What happens tomorrow and next year is completely dependent on what we do today. Whether the United States survives as a democracy or not depends on choices Americans make, things they say, the arguments they have, the degree of civic participation, not some historical rule that some very brilliant political scientist invented. And as I said, I think this has happened before. I think we had this moment of complacency after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s. Americans and Europeans became convinced that everything was best in the best of all possible worlds. And we didn't have to do anything in particular to maintain our democracies because democracy was the best system and we just won the Cold War and it was all going to be fine. And we lost sight of the ways in which democracy was beginning to slip and we were beginning to lose things.
It's not interesting.
And I think it was just a sense of complacency. And above all, it was the sense of inevitability. It's inevitable. We've won the war of ideas. The war of ideas is over. And that's why we missed the rise of Russia. We missed the significance of China. And we missed a lot of those things because we were so sure that we were just winning.
Isn't that in and of itself a cycle?
It's a cycle, but my point is that the cycles aren't predictable. I mean, you can stop the cycle, you can reverse the cycle. Countries can and do change their trajectory. I say I've lived a lot of my life in Poland. First went there in the 1980s. My husband is Polish, and so on. Poland is a completely different country from what it was 30 years ago. And it's a country that has really changed itself in ways that weren't necessarily predictable in 1990. And so I do think countries change.
Is all of this downstream from something that doesn't change, which is human nature? And therefore, if we understand human nature as the constant, then one can almost predict these, dare I say the word again, cycles of how humans will go from there to
Human nature is a constant, but there's so much accident in history and so many random things happen that you can sometimes predict how people will react, but you can't necessarily predict exactly what's coming. When Boris Yeltsin was drunk and sick and had to choose the next leader of Russia, there were a number of choices he had. And the person he chose was Vladimir Putin, who at the time was a very low-ranking, he was a FSB. He came from the KGB, and he was someone they chose because they thought he would be loyal to the Yeltsin family and he wouldn't prosecute them. Nobody imagined him as a dictator or an imperial leader who would be seeking to reconquer the former Soviet Union. And what if they'd chosen, for example, Boris Nemtsov, who was another leading Russian politician at the time? I don't know that he was a perfect Democrat, but he was very open-minded and he would have been interested in integrating Russia with Europe. Okay, what if he'd become the leader of Russia? We would be in a completely different world. And there was nothing inevitable about that decision. There are many random, completely out of the blue things that happen in history. You can always say there's always some percentage of any population that's instinctively authoritarian, for example. And there's always some percentage of any population that's instinctively liberal or instinctively libertarian.
Because of egos and power.
Because of just the way the human nature people have different. But what is the balance of that group? How the leadership of the country encourages or discourages one set of values or the other? That affects how, who's winning the arguments. And so I don't believe in inevitable cycles.
Have you heard of Ray Dalio talking about the sort of boom and bust cycles through history? And when like a population becomes very comfortable, you have this sort of inversion, goes the other way. Do you believe in those kinds of cycles?
I suppose there is a phenomenon whereby, yes, as people become comfortable, then if Frank Fukuyama actually had in his famous book about the end of history, he had a description of, well, what happens if we have, if everybody becomes a liberal democracy and everybody's pretty prosperous, then the next thing that will happen is some people will get bored. And out of their boredom and out of their desire for change, they'll attack the system and want to undermine it. It's kind of what happened. So I suppose there's some human element like that. There will always be some part of the population that feels left out or feels discriminated against and wants a bigger voice or wants to run the country. I mean, so you can see that. I just don't think it's something that scientists can predict.
Is there a link between democracies and sort of rampant capitalism? So in a democracy, I don't know much about this stuff, so I'm just asking a question, but in a democracy, does it tend to be the case that you end up with wealth inequality because you let free markets play out, and then you're going to have these like tech oligarchs up here that have all gazillions of dollars, $1 trillion, and lots of people at the bottom of the rung? Whereas in China, I guess they somewhat defend. I don't know. Do they defend against?
No, I would say almost the opposite.
Oh, really?
So historically, democracies there have been different phases, right? So I don't want to overgeneralize, but certainly in the second half of the 20th century, the democracies since the Second World War have tended towards equality, and including in the United States. And at their most successful and prosperous moments, there was much less wealth inequality than there is now. And the countries we were talking about earlier, the happy countries, those are relatively equal countries. And those are countries with big welfare states and a lot of redistribution of wealth. And those are countries where people feel invested in the system, partly because they don't feel completely outclassed by a group of oligarchs. If you look at the United States in the 1950s, that was a period of also huge social mobility when lower middle class people began to get wealthier. And there's this enormous wave of prosperity. And that's a period when everybody is becoming wealthier. And that was also a period when you have the very successful American democracy. You have the civil rights movement. You have democracy beginning to spread to new populations or to people who'd been excluded before. So you have a connection between equality and democracy. Wealth equality. And one of the things that gives critics of the United States most anxiety now is precisely what you just said, the emergence of tech oligarchs who have so much more power than any one politician and who even have the power to organize information space. How long will that group of people want to live in a democracy where everybody gets a vote and wealth is supposed to be distributed more evenly? There are some members of that community who have become illiberal or anti-democratic for exactly that reason.
If we don't believe in inevitabilities, then what is it we have to look out for as those living in a democracy? We talked about the 5 things there, but is there anything coming up where you're worried that as a society, we might overlook it or allow it, which results in us falling back down into an autocratic society? And is there anything we can do proactively now to defend our democracy?
We are lucky in that we live in societies where we can vote. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important that we vote, that we know who we're voting for, that we vote in all elections, including local ones. When people become nihilistic, when they say they're all the same, I don't care who wins the election, it's not worth voting because, they're all corrupt. This is what autocrats try to create. So what does Putin want Russians to do? Does he want them to be political? No, he wants them to stay out of politics. What do the Chinese want? They want their people out of politics. And so whenever you see too many people who have responded to that kind of negative inspiration, that's when you should worry. And I worry a lot about the United States on exactly those grounds, actually. Look at how the leader of your country talks about the press, how he or she talks about the judges, the judiciary, how he or she talks about the civil service. A real Democrat respects those institutions and wants them to stay in place precisely so that democracy can remain, so that at the next election there will be a fair election.
Do you think the mainstream media are politicized? Do you think there's political bias in the mainstream media, like the big titles?
Some of them have business models that are biased. So Fox's business model is to appeal to the right-leaning part of the American population and to encourage them in their biases and get them to watch TV.
Mm-hmm.
There's some media that are now dependent on polarization and kind of live off it. There's some who try to be neutral, but even neutrality is hard to achieve now because a neutral investigation that turns up something bad about the Trump administration will immediately incur the reaction on the part, you're biased. We've lost our assumption that press are operating in good faith. So it's become much more difficult.
This is so interesting for me as a podcaster who I guess now is considered to be media. The inherent incentives of media mean that if, say I'm running X newspaper and I write a story and I've built up a base of people for whatever reason, right, that want me to say something negative about Trump. I have an economic model and an incentive structure that means that if I write that article, it's going to get 10 times the reach, 10 times the engagement, 10 times the subscribers. If I write the exact opposite article, I know I'm going to get, so if I say Trump is amazing, even though I've built up a base that I think a certain way, the article is going to get a fraction of the reach, the engagement, subscribers. So as a CEO of such a company, you're going to have to hire more and more people, create more and more output to receive the same rewards versus just writing something bad about that particular person. So you become incentivized. But the other factor is that geographically, Democrats and Republicans in the United States exist in certain areas. So if I open my office in New York or LA, most of the people I'm going to be able to hire come with a certain, statistically come with a certain political view. So I do wonder if eventually, the fate of most media organizations is they do get politically captured one way or the other.
You have to fight it.
You have to fight. And as a podcaster, yeah, because now I'm part of the media, I now understand because I feel it. Mm-hmm. So I feel that I sit here with Kamala Harris, I'm attacked. I sit here with Ivanka Trump, I'm attacked. I sit here with Michelle Obama, attacked. Gavin Newsom, attacked. And I understand. There's this great quote, which I favorited the other day. It was like, you have to join a tribe or you get killed by one, or something, words to that effect. And I thought, I get it. I get why some of my peers in podcasting have sought defense behind a particular tribe, because just taking the arrows from both sides is not the nicest feeling in the world.
No. No. I mean, it's funny, when you said mainstream media, I don't even know who that is anymore.
Yeah.
But it's not so much about hearing from both sides. It's about trying to establish what's true.
Yeah.
And so the job of what you do is a little bit different from what journalists do. So journalists go into the world and they gather information, and if they're good journalists, they try to figure out what actually happened, and then they bring it back and they write it down, or they make a video about it, and they try and make sure that it's accurate, right? And so if you're devoted to that project, then you seek to avoid political bias, but inevitably you might wind up saying the president is lying, or the leader of the opposition is lying. And then you're immediately, in the world of people shouting at you and saying you're biased. Mm-hmm. But I do feel that it's really important that this particular profession of the people who go into the world and try and establish reality, that it continues to exist.
I agree.
There needs to be a business model for that. I mean, for democracy to exist, for an accurate and meaningful national conversation to exist, we need to have some people who are trying to figure out what's real.
I agree. And I think those people are incredibly important, which I think people think podcasters won't say, because I think sometimes we're positioned as being like the rebels or radicals or whatever that are doing it from their kitchen. This used to be my kitchen, but but I very much agree. I very much agree that there are incredibly rigorous truth-seeking journalists out there that have this very unique skill, which is not one that I possess or attest to possess at all, that they go deep for long periods of time without bias in search of the truth, and then they deliver it to the world. And I'm well aware that if we lose that, then I lose so many of the things that I fundamentally care about and that I've built my entire life and career on, especially as like a young Black man in business who understands that there's lots of people that came before me that revealed things about the way society functioned that have benefited me. And so that my way of sort of paying that forward is protecting the same privileges as a podcaster.
Because, I mean, there is a danger that we go down a road in which, especially as AI develops and we get more and more of our information online, that we lose touch with reality. Mm-hmm. You know, if AI is only accessing what's available to the model online, mm-hmm. there's still a whole world out there where things are happening, that's not online. Yeah. And making sure that we're constantly in touch with what's reality on the ground, what's really happening in Ukraine, what's really happening in Iran, and not living on just what's available to us on our phones. It's really important.
One of my fears is that the algorithms with AI are becoming better at knowing what to serve me in order to make me dwell, yep. and therefore it creates more ad dollars for the companies. And so I might not just be living in a fake reality, I might be living in a completely personalized one. That's completely different from your own, because as I went on my phone this morning, one of the things, the sections on my phone is suggested for you. Now, this is obviously showing me things that are based on my past viewing consumption. So if I viewed this person having a fight in the street, I'm getting more people having fights in the street. So now my perception is that everyone's having fights in the street. And that means it's harder to connect to each other.
We are very much, I think this has really happened already, that we live in our own algorithms. When you're asking the more fundamental question about the breakdown of democracy, there's nothing more toxic to democracy than polarization. Because if you live in a world where the people on the other side of the political divide aren't just your rivals and you don't just disagree with them about taxes, but they are your existential enemies. And if they're in charge, then, the world ends. Then it's very hard to have a normal democratic debate or create a normal, have a normal election.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what this is?
It looks like a very old newspaper.
It's a very old newspaper from a long time ago. And you're in it.
Oh, gosh. Oh, it's, wow. That's that took a lot of research.
Yeah. What is that?
That is, they don't even have these anymore. That was a New York Times wedding announcement.
From 1992, I think.
From 1992.
Which is the year I was born.
I have been married since 1992. I'm still married to the person who it was announced that I was marrying. He was then a journalist. And now he's the Polish foreign minister. We got married in Washington, but he was born in Poland, and it's a long story. But anyway.
Lots of photos of you here. Interesting. Oh, there's a nice one as well. You're looking very presidential there.
That was a long time ago.
And then I've got another one of him and Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Politics has been a big part of your family's life in various ways.
It would be hard to deny that, yeah.
Is it stressful? Because it's constant and it's more polarizing than ever before, and it's divisive, and it's a lot of energy. Even talking about these things I find to be quite energy draining.
Yes. Actually, it became more stressful in more recent years. Social media made it more stressful than it used to be. Mm-hmm. The stressful part is living a part of your life in public. We try to not live all of our lives in public. This has been very useful to me as a journalist, actually. You begin to understand the difference between what you look like in public and what your reality is. So people react to you in all kinds of ways, depending on where they've seen you on TV or what stories they've read about you, some of which might not be true. And there's often a kind of, that the way you're perceived is not necessarily the way you are. And so I try to keep that in mind when I meet public figures, that I have a set of perceptions of them based on what I've read about them, mm-hmm. which I wouldn't have if I met, somebody introduces me to the next door neighbor. I wouldn't have that in my head when I met them. Mm-hmm. But when you meet a politician or somebody who's well known, you come with stuff. And I try when I meet people to drop it as much as I can.
Because you've seen that at home.
Because I've seen it at home. So yes. We have compatible lives that are somewhat different. I have stayed well away from Polish politics. I don't play any role in it. I have a different name from my husband, which, I didn't change my name. And that was also has let us allowed us to be separate. And we share a lot of views, but not all. And so we have kind of different trajectories. But as I said, I find mostly knowing what it's like to be a politician helps me understand them.
Have you ever thought about going into politics yourself?
No. You can't have two politicians in one family. A lot of what I do is journalism, or it's something, or journalist adjacent. I go in and try and find things. I try and explain them. I try and say what I think is happening. And the job of a politician is quite different from that. You arrive with a set of views. You need to explain them to people. You need to convince them. It's a different way of thinking about approaching the public. So I'm not campaigning for a cause.
Is there a particular outcome you're seeking with the work that you do, with the books that you write and the conversations you have? Is there one particular outcome above all others that you're aiming at?
There's an outcome that's general but not specific. In other words, I'm not trying to elect any particular person to be president. I do have a goal that is to remind people of why democracy is important, why we need to maintain it, and to pay attention to the ways in which it's declining, so that we can fight back. I have a broad goal in that sense, and that's not only inside the United States.
Why is this so personal to you?
It's the thing I've been fascinated by since I was in my 20s.
Why?
Because I saw the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union. I was a student in Leningrad when it was still Leningrad. I felt what it was like to live in a heavily autocratic society, even briefly. And I have really spent the rest of my life trying to understand what it was, how it worked, why people went along with it. And I've also spent a lot of time more recently trying to warn people against it, against going in that direction. It's also not the thing I thought I would be doing. I changed, if you're looking at my books, I wrote 3 history books. Yeah. I wrote the Gulag book. I wrote a history of the Ukrainian famine. I wrote a book. This is a book about how the Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe, how they sort of did regime change in Eastern Europe after the war. They're about things that happened, in the distant past. But I had a realization in about 2014, 2015, that I was living through a period of history myself. In other words, there was a historical shift happening around me, and I felt the need to start recording it as a kind of eyewitness. And so that book, Twilight of Democracy, was a description. It starts with a description of a party I gave. And then the book is about how people I knew had changed. I knew a lot of people who had been very radicalized. I knew lots of people on the center right. We were anti-communists, we were, Thatcherites, Reaganites, and I saw many of them become more radical. And I thought, this is a really important moment of change, and so I should record it as a witness. And so that book is the first book that I wrote in the first person about something I'd seen. And that was just me being affected by the world I live in. Maybe it did matter that I was married to a politician, because some things that you would have noticed in a more distant way affected me personally. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was the particular circumstances of being both American and Polish and seeing a similar pattern of things happening in both places. Either way, I felt that something important was happening, and I've really been motivated for the last decade to explain it to people and try and understand it.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.